Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. Thanks so much for tuning in. I love coming to you and bringing you some information. I hope that you share this with other people that maybe are experiencing some of the things that we talk about. Our library of podcasts is quite large, so there is something there for just about everybody. We're talking this time about different types of diagnoses. I've spent a little bit of time going through some of the histories, like for attention deficit and dyslexia. And now we are taking a look at stress, anxiety, PTSD. There's a few other ones that fall under this canopy as well, like OCD, phobias, things like that. But it's important to always bring back to the center of what I try to bring to my podcast is this idea of development and how development plays an enormous part in how a child is going to develop, how they're going to behave. That word, sometimes I think it's just a word that is trying to define so much, and we're just going to use it in the framework of how they are interacting in any given environment, because so many things about kids really isn't a behavior. It's more about an automatic response to an environment, whether it's inside of their body or outside of their body, when any time their development has experienced some kind of interruption. And there are many, many different interruptions. In fact, when we are going to look at a child or even an adult, everything begins with the blueprint. And the blueprint is the patient history. It is the intake form. And that we want to go as far back as we possibly can. We want to look at the pregnancy. We want to look at the birth, and we want to look at the child's years from infancy to their current age. There are so many things that go on in the pregnancy period, as well as the first 7.5 to 8 years. It doesn't stop there, but that is just where the explosion of development occurs. So when things get interrupted, it can most definitely and typically will impact the outcome. So if I don't plan my pregnancy, I don't know the state of health that I'm entering into this season. If I have trauma during my pregnancy, if I have marital discord, if I have illnesses, if I suffer a loss, any of those and others would absolutely impact the outcome. If the birth of the baby is a C-section or instruments are used to pull that baby out, or there is some type of other emergency during that period, it will impact the outcome. And then as we come into this world, if we are ill all the time, if we have chronic colds, if we have chronic ear infections, if we have strep, all of those things will impact the outcome. And so as we dive into this, I really want to separate out a diagnosis of a mental disorder and begin to look through the lens of a developmental season. And did things go on that could have potentially led to the state of where that child is right now. We always start with the word stress. Stress is a response in which an individual wants to have more control over a situation. The constant state of stress is considered anxiety. And typically, the anxiousness is being drawn from what's going to happen in the future. Now, towards the end of the podcast, we're going to talk about the QEEG, which is the way that we do a brain map here at Connect My Brain. And that's my role in looking at these different types of diagnoses in conjunction that children are so close to the beginning of their life and looking at their blueprint that has made their brain go into the direction that we see on a brain map. So once a person reaches a state of anxiety or worry or even PTSD, it suggests a higher degree of instability and brain dysregulation and the possibility of trauma or further trauma. And that's why getting the whole picture is so important. Anxiety is completely on the rise for our children and our adolescents today. It is showing about 1 in 8 kids are experiencing some type of anxiety. And there is many reasons why. One of the things, though, that a lot of the research continues to look at is that children's lives have changed so much compared to like when I grew up. They're almost non-stop screen involving or engaged in screen time. And typically, screen time is also sitting down or laying down. So sedentary. Now, in podcasts before, I've talked about how important movement is. Let's just highlight that when a woman's pregnant, when she sees either her midwife or her OB, they literally ask, do you feel the baby moving? Movement is imperative for the neurological connections to happen during pregnancy. When you look at a baby, that baby is not reading and writing and doing arithmetic. That baby is moving. The sedentary lifestyle that we are seeing with our children is coming at the expense of play and physical activity. And that's where you decompress, is when you are moving. In fact, I was listening to a podcast on anxiety, and I thought this one little pearl was just incredible, that they've literally studied the importance of forward motion for people with anxiety. So literally getting up and moving forward so that one, you're moving, you're getting your heart rate up, but you're also stepping into that idea of forward motion, which is like stepping into the future. But you've got your heart rate up, you're getting the stress chemicals off of your body. And when we do this for a 20-minute period within our target heart rate, you are literally producing a protein in your brain that enhances novel learning. So all over the place, it's talking about the importance of movement. So that's one piece. And then the other part of it is today, kids are having to think about new things that we don't even have a point of reference about. And so if we don't have the ability to explain all the things that are going on because we really don't know where the past 3.5 years is leading us, how do we guide our children? And our children absolutely are picking up on our emotional energies and dysregulations. So there's always the idea of children being exposed to cultural issues that can also breed anxiety. So if we are in any kind of economic, financial situations, or maybe just the area that we live in could also be difficult for a child to regulate themselves, those are going to also play an impact on how that child begins to handle what they're feeling and what am I going to do with it. Another issue that impacts children and can create anxiety is that phrase, the helicopter parent, meaning that if you're not giving your child the opportunity, all age appropriate, but if you're not giving them the opportunity to actually problem solve and make a mistake or even fail, then when something of greater intensity comes along, how do you know how to handle it? So let's talk about the development of worry. For a child to actually worry about something, there has to be some cognitive development that has already occurred. Now, it does begin even as early as birth. You are born with principally two emotions, but they are about attracting and pulling away. And when you study neurofeedback like I have and the brain, those are the principal words they still use to discuss any behavior response by child or adult. Is the person going towards it or is the person going away? Those are the foundational pieces of how the human being is going to respond. And from that, we're going to build on top of it. So, does your child go towards or does your child go away? Now, again, you can see this as early as infancy, but even at 6 months, if you're playing peekaboo with your little one and you take your scarf and you cover your face and then you show it and your baby is engaging with you. And so now maybe you put the scarf down. What did the baby do? Lots of babies will literally make sounds, and they will be at this point able to combine a vowel sound and a consonant sound. And they will, hey, like, what are you doing? And move their hands and literally, physically, behaviorally demonstrate, hey, I want to play. So they're trying to go towards, they're trying to engage rather than you playing peekaboo and your child not doing anything. Around 8 months is when a child actually begins to develop the fear of being separated from mama. And this will continue typically 18 months to 3 years. But this is a huge red flag if it continues to persist beyond these expected developmental milestones. This is why I also keep bringing up last year, CDC changed the developmental milestones. And I really encourage you. One, I've got a download on my website under the podcast tab. It's a free download, print it off, do your own research in this. But if we don't know when a child is supposed to do something, then how do you gauge what's really going on? And these milestones that were recently changed, nobody has even looked at these in 20 years. And the whole basis of the CDC changing these things is based on an opinion that they were going to only promote the ones that at least 75% of the population demonstrated. But there was also this conversation back and forth that many people felt like this was only because of how the children were treated over the last 3.5 years, especially last year, being masked up and what this did to their academics. But this is actually something that goes further back, because we started with an epidemic of autism in the 80s. And around 2016, it was also 1 in 5 kids are having trouble learning. So there has been a steady progression of childhood development being interrupted. But it appears because they are making it okay to do things later, that it is literally normalizing developmental delay. And I've been doing the work that I do for 28 years, and I can tell you, I have seen a steady progression and now an absolute leap in the number of children with developmental delay, with stress and anxiety, little ones, 4 and 5 year olds. And they're coming from very good homes. And definitely there are some that have extenuating circumstances going on, but there is one solid parent. And why do we have so many children not going in the right direction? There's more to this. So when we think about these timelines, especially this one, if a child is going through separation anxiety and you're going, but it's the typical time, I still want to put caution, because it's not the only window of development that's open. So your gut is going to mature by age 2. That's 24 months. And your immune system is going to mature by 3 years. So if we've got this anxious state, and in the last podcast, we highlighted what happens with the sympathetic response. And there's several other podcasts that even talk about the impact of chronic stress. This is just one layer after another. We're changing the way that the neurology is coming online while different windows of maturing are going on. And if a person is now past just stress and is in anxiety, there are not only gut changes and blood flow changes and breathing changes, but now there's being patterns set up in the brain. And when I do a brain map on these little ones, you can see the patterns. You can see the over aroused state. And remember, I always want you to link that word aroused back to the Moro reflex, because the Moro reflex turns on arousal, CO2O2 reflex, and the sympathetic nervous system. This is key in understanding our physiology. And so when I tell you to think about the environment, I want you to think about the environment on the outside as well as on the inside. So the outside would be like sedentary lifestyle in front of a device. And internal environment is the impact of what I'm watching and how it's putting me in a fight or flight, whether it's real or imagined, and I am changing my physiology. When you have these reactions, it is not just this outward state. Every single organ and your brain are involved. And this is where you can set up patterns that create such dysregulation that literally can become paralyzing for a child. Children can worry, and when they worry, they feel alone. And the main reason why is because they don't have a point of reference that this is something I should really tell someone. And that's why we have got to look on the outside. They're in more imaginative states. It's really heightened at this time as little children, and they're depending on what's going on in their environment and what they're being exposed to. And they may just kind of think up all kinds of problems. I even did a podcast with this mom very early on. But one of the things that I was working with a child, and this little child, when he was around 4, had a very bad experience at a daycare. And he thought he was going to be the last one being picked up. And apparently there were some comments made that the worker wanted to go home and that adult really wasn't behaving like an adult, and really said some things to even frighten the child more, and then change the environment by turning the lights off. And so this got laid down in a critical period of time, because that subconscious is being shaped from the last trimester to about 7.5, 8.5 years old. This is one of the questions I ask people all the time, regardless of age. When is the first time that you ever remember feeling like this? When did that event occur? Because it will give me a piece of the blueprint to help me know how far down this event settled inside of them. And that literally can become the hard wiring to that child. Now, as I was mentioning before, today is a whole new story. Today, our kids are worried about terrorists and school shootings, and they're actually having drills for school shootings. Do you remember I remember doing fire drills, and that alone was enough. But now we don't have just fire drills, we have shooting drills. In addition, kids are worried about being accepted and liked by their classmates. They're worried about being bullied, being humiliated, being excluded, being invited to parties and events. Children are worried about making a mistake or meeting their parents' expectations. Children, I would say, probably from the 2nd grade to about the second year of college, all they want to do is be like their peers. And they're going to constantly monitor the room, and they're going to see if they're measuring up. It is an innate thing. It's not something we necessarily don't want them to do because there's a healthy exercise involved. But a lot of the classrooms don't make that growth go in a positive direction. If there is situations going on at home, if parents are not getting along, if there's marital discord, if there's fighting, this can create a lot of insecurity for children about their security in life. And they will become hypervigilant. And that hypervigilance is going to make them pay attention more to negative situations, like the little guy I was just telling you about. In that situation, the little guy who got left, he was the last one to be picked up. He really wasn't left. And the facility was still open. Mom just happened to be the last one there. But that association that got laid down carried with him. And I'll never forget, one day he was here and we were doing neurofeedback. And I had not yet experienced how far this association or insecurity had been rooted in this child. And literally, he was the last one here. And we were going around and we were closing blinds and, just kind of getting a few things done because it was the end of the day. And this child went right into a panic attack. And I mean, he leaped over the chair in such panic. So that is a hypervigilant response. And he just wanted out because in his mind, he was back in that situation that could make him feel that level of fear and panic again. The very first thing we did, and this is a pretty common practice in my office, is we went right to the treadmill. Those stress chemicals are going up. And if we don't use them for energy, it's going to be very difficult for the individual to shift and come back into the present and realize where they are, be able to see that mom is even right there and that they really are okay. We have to practice those responses so that we can get them to go in another direction. We can't sit there and reason with little kids. They don't have that ability yet to sit there and have a long, drawn out conversation where some of them really what they might end up doing is just shaking their head, agreeing with you, because they've learned if I just let you think that I've acknowledged you, you're going to let me out of this. Kids are very clever and they're building their own weaponry to be able to handle their life when they get into this kind of state. However, it's having an incredible impact. If you're noticing that your child worries, and you're saying to yourself, I'm concerned that maybe my child does have anxiety. Is it impacting their sleep? Is it impacting school? This may be a kid that doesn't even want to go to school. I find that so heartbreaking to think that a child would not want to go to school because that is their world. That's where they are. They're learning and they should be going towards it. So not wanting to go to something is absolutely a red flag. Are they not engaging in other activities? Anxiety can be linked to phobias like I'm afraid of being alone. It can create a pattern of OCD and, in very serious cases, even cause what's called elective mutism. And that means I'm just not going to talk. So I really wanted to add that piece because when you look at development and you're looking at the picture of primitive reflexes and the midline transition that we expect a child to go towards, we don't expect far extreme right or far extreme left, because both of those extreme patterns have issues. If we go to the right, that's the very anxious side. If we go to the left, that's the withdrawn, autism, and guess what else? Elective mutism. So I found that interesting because that's even a pattern that is identified in a retained primitive reflex known as the Moro reflex. Something you may see in the beginning, like early on with your little baby, they may resist wanting to explore their environment. Again, it's going towards or pulling away. Once that baby gets on the ground, and babies should be very comfortable on their bellies, they should be able to engage in little toys that you might have around. They need the space of not always being held, but exploring their own bodies. And then once they get into locomotion, they should be into everything. And if your little one is not doing that, they may be perceiving their environment as threatening. Now, there's also a lot of reasons that can lead to these. Okay, there can be something very drastic that happened, and the cause isn't even known yet. Trauma is always an easy one that can explain what has happened to someone, but sometimes some of these things, I call them invisible injuries that people aren't even aware of yet. But if that child isn't going towards something, then they're actually being pulled back into the brainstem. And this is the precursor to Moro, known as fear paralysis. This type of response is going to involve the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex, okay? Those three areas of the brain. So again, if a child is so close to the beginning, think of what you may see and how it's influencing how that brain is going to come online. So, with our working definition of anxiety, a state of uneasiness and apprehension about the future. So, when we look at a brain map, what would that look like on a brain map? Okay, so one of the studies has found an association between anxiety, fear, insecurity, panic, and phobias, demonstrating high activation of the amygdala and it being expressed in areas that are right behind your ears. This is known as your temporal lobe. And it's identifying that we would see an over aroused pattern on the brain map. What's also been found is excessive activation. So both of these are talking about an over aroused state of the brain. Excessive activation of the posterior region of the brain. So that means the back of the brain, indicating that the individual is thinking a lot about the past, analyzing, criticizing, or judging. When this blood flow becomes concentrated at the back of the brain, it generates anxiety because the individual is not doing anything. The present moment is not being lived in, and nothing can be done to change the events that the individual is continuously thinking about from the past and from the future. Now, lots of times when we're focused more in the past, there can be a greater state of depression. Now, I am not a counselor, and I am certainly not trying to uh, indicate that this is in the same arena as how a counselor would address things. So when I talk about depression, I'm talking about a depressed state. However, many people with diagnosed anxiety and or depression do find incredible benefits by combining neurofeedback to their regime, because it's been around for a while and you can literally see these patterns. And we can go in and provide a therapy that brings homeostasis back into the brain. So now you're not only working through this with a mental health practitioner, but you're also empowering yourself and creating the practice of self regulation inside of your brain, because that is the backbone to neurofeedback. It is about you learning, your child learning how to regulate themselves. And it's so interesting. So, one of the things that we do in neurofeedback is you utilize filters, and there's a visual filter and there's an auditory filter. And so you're connecting the software to the individual as well as to whatever it is that they're watching. And so when their brain is in the desired state, they're going to get the reward. Ooh, there's that word, reward, going towards. So the subconscious is going to pick up that pattern, and they're going to start to see the screen is brighter more often, and they're going to hear the sounds associated with the brightness. Now, it takes a few sessions for the child to connect the dots. But I remember one day talking to this little girl who had literally lost all hope about going to school. And the very first time that she tried neurofeedback, I took a little extra time to explain it. I love when I get these organic moments when I get to explain. And I'll tell you about one of those in a second. But I really wanted her to know that her brain was fine. We just needed to reorganize some things. That's all. So I began to explain to her how those filters work. And you could tell right in her face, she got it. Oh, yeah, I see it. She goes, that's my brain. I go, yes, your brain is literally connecting right now. And every time it gets bright and every time you hear that little puff sound, that is your brain doing it for itself. And she was just amazed. So a few minutes later, I walked back over there and I said, "You're never going to believe it. You've already received 330 points." And what that means is in about 10 minutes, she had already brought her brain into the correct state 330 times. Well, she got emotionally excited. She goes, "I can't believe it. This is great. I've got this." When you tie an elevated emotion to your accomplishment, you have just launched your brain over the obstacle. And ever since that day, this was her first day with neurofeedback, I have seen a brighter child every single time. Now, it doesn't always happen that way. I also have a few little cherubs here that get rather frustrated when I put that visual filter over the screen, because initially it's dark. And so in order for them to see the show, they gotta get connected. And the way that you get connected is passive awareness. This isn't like flexing a muscle. You've got to let go and let your brain figure it out. And so I have a couple of them that when I brought the visual filter over the screen, hey, what are you doing? Get that thing off there. And I go, well, hey, that's up to you. You're the one that's got to make it bright. Well, how do I do that? I don't know. You got to sit there and try to figure it out. But I'll tell you, all of them, regardless of their little beginnings, I can see them when they get done. We see their points. They all get stickers. And I'll say, hey, how did you do today? I did well. How do you know? Because the picture was bright most of the time. So they've already connected with the process. That's just the perfect combination when they realize they are regulating themselves. The amygdala is a place that is literally going to monitor if you're going to go through a threatening situation. And we'll go deeper into this when we talk about PTSD next time. Because what happens in long-standing stress and anxiety, which can typically lead to PTSD, is whatever that event is, whatever that element, whenever it started, it was sensed by the amygdala that then began to say, this is a threat. And for simplicity, what I'd like to say is it gives it a code and it begins to monitor. Remember, if you stay in that state of anxiety, you actually become hyper vigilant. So it stays in that state, constantly monitoring your environment inside and out. And does anything potentially look like what that initial issue was that was perceived as a threat, rather real or imagined? And the longer that this stays going on, the response is getting further burrowed into the brain and it's becoming more sensitive. And it no longer needs, I guess I really should say less sensitive. Yes, it doesn't need the exact code anymore. So for example, this is purely an example, but let's say it coded the initial one MNOP. Well, now if it's been going on for a while, maybe it only looks for MNO or OP, or maybe now it just looks for an M. And these responses are generated. Remember the three structures of the brain: amygdala, hypothalamus, and hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex are now communicating. But the responses are happening before it ever comes around to the frontal lobe for somebody to make a conscious decision, a decision with reasoning, if this is actually a threat or not. And your hippocampus really saturates itself with stress chemicals. And this is a structure that is so important in learning and memory. But when we're talking about children, not all this stuff is developed yet. We also find that there's going to be an excessive amount of beta waves. Beta waves are your fast waves, and they're going to appear in children around the ages of 5 and 6. And they're going to be laid down in different locations. And so when I'm talking about the organization of the brain, this is what I'm referring to, is that there are expected areas for these brain waves to dominate. So there's 3 different levels of the beta waves. The first one we're going to call low beta, and these are around 12 to 15 hertz. And these are principally around the sensory motor cortex. So for my podcast audience, I literally have my hand on top of my head, and it's right about the middle of the head. And this is where we make the connections of sensory motor. So again, children closer to the beginning, how is this area getting wired up? They should have it in the right place. They should have the correct amount. And this is what's going to ensure proper sensory motor connections. Then we've got 15 to 23 hertz, and that's about our mid range. And that's going to be principally in the frontal lobe. And then we've got high beta waves, which are 23 to 38. And they can be everywhere, but they're really not meant to be up all the time, because their job, those very fast waves, 23 to 38 hertz, their job is to alert the individual through fear, anxiety, and hypervigilance. So I can literally look at a brain map and begin to identify where this brain is dysregulated and why this little person is in the state that they're in. So what does Connect My Brain? How do we do this? How does Connect My Brain accomplish change? Well, it's a 3-tier approach. It's mechanical, chemical, brain. We're going to look at the developmental milestones. I've got a very keen eye, and I can see where things might be off. For example, when you come into this world, you're a little flexed body. You begin to lift your head. You then get into your shoulders and your upper torso. Then you begin to get into the middle of your torso and further down into your arms. And then you're going to get all the way into your hands, your trunk, your pelvis, and then into your legs. But you get your upper body before you get your lower body. So around 4 and 5, you should be able to do a jumping jack. So we ask them, do a jumping jack. We look at the timing. Can you move your arms and legs at the same time? Now, absolutely, lots of kids can, but some kids can't. They'll move the arms and then they just jump up and down with their legs. And they may look perfectly fine on the outside, but that's a timing issue. And timing has to do with how both sides of the brain talk to each other. Then we look at a brain map. So all those details that I was just talking about. If I have a child who's coming in for anxiousness and stress, I'm going to be really looking at the back of the brain. I'm going to be really looking at their temporal lobes. I'm going to see, is that brain organized as it's supposed to be? We even tie in through our physical work the hippocampus. As I told you earlier in the podcast, when you do 20 minutes of cardiovascular aerobic activity in your target heart rate, you burn off the stress chemicals and you act off of the hippocampus, and you actually create a protein in your brain. And we are teaching these little cherubs this all the time. And then you got to look at the chemistry. You can be really good at therapies, but boy, if that chemistry is off, it's very hard to make all of this stick. And what's ever in that history, like we were talking about, what's going on in the gut? Because it matures by age 2. What's going on in the immune system? What's been going on in the immune system? How has it impacted this child's development? When you put all 3 pieces together, you make change, and you just cannot. All right, that's a long one today, But thanks for staying in touch. Please share this information with anyone that you think can benefit. Always want to give a hats off to my podcast manager, Marcy Page. She's always helping me pull these things together. Couldn't do it without her. We'd love for you to get in contact with us. Go ahead and reach out. The phone number is 678 501 5172. You can also go to the website, connectmybrain.com, and send us a message. Thanks for tuning in and be blessed.